The gate agent's computer didn't just flash an error message. It screamed in bold red letters, "Flight 714. Grounded by executive order." On the other side of the counter, 18-year-old twins Jordan and Jayla Sterling stood in stunned silence, their boarding passes still clutched in their hands. They had been denied boarding, humiliated in front of 100 strangers. One phone call was all it took. One call to their father, a man who didn't just own a company, but owned the entire airline. They thought they had won. But what they didn't know was that in pulling the plug on one flight, they had just ignited a firestorm that would consume everything their family had ever built. This isn't just a story of privilege. It's a story of power consequences and the brutal, unforgiving nature of karma. The air in John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 was thick with the usual cocktail of emotions. The frantic energy of the late, the weary patience of the delayed, and the bubbling excitement of the vacation-bound. For Jayla and Jordan Sterling, it was pure, unadulterated excitement. 18 years old, fresh out of a prestigious Manhattan prep school with matching valedictorian and salutatorian honors, they were finally free. Their golden ticket wasn't just the first-class boarding pass to Ibiza in their hands. It was the future itself, sprawling before them like an endless runway. They were identical in appearance, the same high cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, and athletic frames that spoke of a life filled with tennis lessons and personal trainers. But there the similarities ended. Jayla was the anchor. She moved with a deliberate calm, her eyes scanning the chaos of the gate area with the cool assessment of a chess master. She had their passports, their documents, and their itinerary organized in a crisp leather folio. She was the planner, the thinker, the one who saw 5 steps ahead. Her excitement was a quiet, steady hum beneath the surface. Jordan was the spark. He practically vibrated with energy, his head swiveling to take everything in a restless grin playing on his lips. He was the charmer, the speaker, the one who believed any problem could be solved with the right combination of confidence and pressure. His excitement was a firework, brilliant and impossible to ignore. Today, it was brighter than ever. "Can you believe it, Jay?" Jordan nudged his sister, his voice a low thrum of anticipation. 3 weeks. No parents, no tutors, no curfew, just sun, sand, and, well, you know. Jayla allowed herself a small, perfect smile. "I know. Just try to keep your passport this time. I'm not bailing you out of a Spanish consulate." "Hey, that was one time, and I got it back," he retorted, though they both knew Jayla had orchestrated its return with a series of flawlessly polite but firm phone calls. Their father, Damian Sterling, had gifted them the trip. It was his style grand gestures that served as both reward and expectation. Damian was a titan of industry, the CEO of Sterling Global Aviation, a massive holding company that owned shipping lines, logistics firms, and most notably, the very airline they were about to fly, Stellar Air. To the twins, Stellar Air was just Dad's airline, a familiar and reliable part of their gilded world. They flew it constantly, always treated with the deferential courtesy extended to the family of the man at the top. It was a privilege they rarely thought about as natural to them, as breathing. They approached the boarding line for Flight 714 to Ibiza, a direct 10-hour journey filled with the promise of European nightlife. The line was long, a snaking queue of summer travelers. They made their way to the priority boarding lane, their first-class tickets a pass to bypass the main crowd. At the podium stood the gate agent. Her name tag read, Bailey. She looked to be in her late 40s with a severe haircut, and an expression etched with the permanent fatigue of someone who had dealt with one too many irate passengers. Her eyes, magnified by thick-lensed glasses, swept over the boarding queue with a look of profound dissatisfaction. She was the gatekeeper, and this was her kingdom. When the twins reached the front, Jayla placed their passports and boarding passes on the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and polite. Bailey didn't return the greeting. She picked up Jayla's passport. Her lips pursed into a thin line. She scanned it, then looked up, her eyes narrowing as she compared the photo to Jayla's face. She did the same with Jordan's. Bailey murmured a small, dismissive sound. She tapped a long, manicured nail on the glossy page of Jordan's passport. This photo. It looks smudged. The holographic overlay seems distorted right here. Jordan leaned in. Smudged. "It was issued 3 months ago. It's brand new. Sir, I'm the one who determines if a travel document is valid for international travel. Not you." Bailey said, her voice taking on a sharp, officious edge. She held it under the small desk lamp, tilting it back and forth. The integrity of the document appears compromised. "I can't accept this." Jayla's calm demeanor remained, but a flicker of annoyance registered in her eyes. "With all due respect, ma'am, I think you'll find it's perfectly fine. Perhaps the light is catching it strangely." "Are you telling me how to do my job?" Bailey's gaze hardened. She pushed the passport back across the counter. "I'm not comfortable with this. I can't allow you to board." The finality in her tone was like a gauntlet thrown down. The easy sun-drenched path to Ibiza had just hit a wall named Bailey. And for the first time that day, Jordan's confident grin vanished, replaced by a thundercloud of disbelief and anger. The kingdom had its gatekeeper, and the gate was now closed. A bubble of silence seemed to expand around the four of them, Jayla, Jordan, Bailey, and the passport lying between them like a failed peace treaty. The background noise of the terminal faded as Jordan's shock curdled into indignation. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You're denying me boarding because of a so-called smudge that you can't even point out properly." "I don't need to point it out to you, sir. I've made my determination based on my training and airline policy." Bailey retorted, her posture rigid. She had dealt with entitled young men like him, before all swagger and assumed authority. She found a grim satisfaction in being the one person their money and attitude couldn't bypass. Jayla, ever the diplomat, stepped forward slightly, placing a calming hand on her brother's arm. "Ma'am, my name is Jayla Sterling, and this is my brother Jordan. I understand your concern for security. We all appreciate it, but I assure you our documents are legitimate. Is there a supervisor we could perhaps speak to, just to get a second opinion?" Her tone was flawless, respectful, reasonable, and non-confrontational. It was a strategy that usually disarmed even the most difficult people. But Bailey was not most people. To her, this was no longer about a passport. It was about authority. She saw their expensive clothes, their easy confidence, and felt a surge of resentment. They were everything she wasn't. "My supervisor will tell you the same thing. I am," Bailey said, crossing her arms. "Policy is policy. A compromised document is grounds for denial of boarding. End of story." By now, the passengers in the line behind them were growing restless. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some shot the twins annoyed looks, blaming them for the delay. Others watched Bailey with a familiar sense of dread, having been on the receiving end of such bureaucratic power plays themselves. "This is ridiculous." Jordan snapped his temper, finally breaking free. We fly this airline a dozen times a year. We've never had a problem. Never. Get your manager, now. The word manager acted as a trigger. Bailey's eyes flashed with a cold fire. She picked up her microphone, her voice sharp and loud, designed for public humiliation. Paging supervisor to gate B24. Supervisor to B24 for a passenger dispute. A few minutes later, a harried-looking man named Carl jogged up his tie askew and a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looked overwhelmed before the conversation even began. Bailey quickly explained the situation, framing it in the sterile language of security protocols. Potential document tampering Carl. I'm not comfortable with the risk. Carl, the terminal duty manager, was a man who navigated his day by avoiding conflict. His primary skill was de-escalation, which usually meant siding with his staff to present a unified front. He glanced at the passport, then at the two impeccably dressed, angry teenagers, and then back at his most stubborn employee. He made a calculated decision to take the path of least resistance. I have to stand by my agent's assessment, Carl said, directing his words to the twins, but avoiding eye contact. She's trained to spot these irregularities. It's a security issue. I'm sorry, but we can't let you on the plane. You're siding with her. Jordan's voice was incredulous. Look at it. It's perfect. This is a joke. Is it because we're black? Is that what this is? The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Bailey recoiled, as if struck, her face flushing with anger. How dare you? This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with the rules. Carl's eyes widened in panic. This was the one thing he was trained to avoid at all costs. Now let's not make accusations. This is simply a procedural matter. But the damage was done. The atmosphere had turned toxic. Jailer, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, knew that logic and reason had left the building. The final boarding call for Flight 714 echoed through the terminal. The last few passengers shuffled past them, casting curious glances. That's it, Bailey announced with an air of triumph. Boarding is closed. She turned to the gate door operator. Close it up. With a hydraulic hiss, the heavy door to the jet bridge began to slide shut, the metallic thud of it locking, echoing like a judge's gavel. Their flight, their vacation, their escape, it was gone. Jordan stood there, trembling with a mixture of rage and helplessness. He looked at the closed door, then at the smirking gate agent, and then at the weak-willed manager. He felt a primal urge to shout, to slam his fist on the counter, to make a scene that would get them escorted out by security. But Jailer put a firm hand on his shoulder. Her eyes were no longer calm. They were cold, hard chips of obsidian. The diplomat had left. The strategist had taken her place. Don't, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but charged with intensity. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you lose control. They've made their decision. Now we make ours. Jordan looked at his sister, confused. What are you talking about? It's over, Jay. They won. Jailer pulled out her sleek, top-of-the-line smartphone. Her expression was utterly devoid of emotion. No, she said, her thumb swiping across the screen to find a specific contact. It's not over. We're just going to escalate this to a slightly higher authority. She found the name in her contacts listed simply as Dad. She pressed the call button, lifted the phone to her ear, and looked directly at Bailey, who was watching them with a smug, dismissive expression. The call connected. Hi, Dad. Jailer said, her voice steady and clear. Sorry to bother you. Jordan and I are having a bit of trouble at JFK. Yes, with Stellar Air. Gate B24. There's an agent here. Her name is Bailey, who has denied us boarding. Her supervisor, Carl, backed her up. Yes, Dad. Your airline. Damian Sterling was in a glass-walled boardroom on the 58th floor of the Sterling Global Aviation Tower in Midtown Manhattan. Below him, the city buzzed with its relentless energy, a metropolis he felt he had in many ways conquered. He was in the middle of a tense negotiation with a French avionics firm, the air thick with financial jargon and the subtle dance of corporate power. His phone, which was usually on silent during such meetings, was set to vibrate only for calls from a select few. When it buzzed with Jailer's name, he felt a familiar mix of pride and paternal concern. He held up a hand, a gesture that silenced the entire room instantly. "Excuse me for one moment, gentlemen," he said, his voice a smooth baritone that commanded effortless respect. He stepped into his private adjoining office, the skyline of New York, his backdrop, and answered the call. "Jailer, is everything all right?" As he listened to his daughter's calm, precise explanation, his expression underwent a chilling transformation. The amiable corporate titan vanished, replaced by something far colder and more dangerous. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his phone. He didn't interrupt. He just absorbed the details. Wait B24. Stellar Air. Bailey. Carl. A smudged passport. Denied boarding. The perceived injustice was one thing. The accusation of bias, however subtly it might have been provoked, was another. But the core insult, the one that ignited a cold fire in his gut, was the sheer incompetence and disrespect shown to his children. His children on his airline. It was a personal affront, a breakdown of the perfect, orderly world he had built and meticulously controlled. "Put your brother on the phone, please," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Jailer handed the phone to Jordan, who was still simmering with rage. "Dad, Jordan." "Listen to me very carefully," Damian said. "Do not raise your voice. Do not engage with them further. You and your sister are to stand right where you are and do nothing. Do you understand me?" "But Dad," they closed the door. "The plane is still there. They just won't let us." "I am aware of the situation, son," Damian cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I will handle it. Stay put. I am on my way." He hung up. For a full 10 seconds he stood motionless, staring out at the city. Then he turned and strode back into the boardroom. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice devoid of any warmth, "this meeting is concluded for today. Something has come to my attention that requires my immediate and personal focus. We will reschedule." The French executives, bewildered, could only nod as he swept out of the room. His executive assistant, a hyper-efficient woman named Amelia, was already on her feet as he entered his main office. "Amelia, get me Robert Walsh," he commanded. Robert Walsh was the chief operating officer for Stellar Air. "Then get me the head of JFK operations, and find out who the terminal duty manager at T4 is. I want a name. His name is Carl." As Amelia's fingers flew across her keyboard, Damian paced. He wasn't a man given to overt displays of anger. His rage was a pressure vessel building silently until it was channeled into precise, devastating action. This wasn't just about his children's ruined vacation. It was about the system. His system. A gear had jammed a lowly employee, had dared to exercise her minuscule power in a way that had embarrassed his family. It was an infection, and he was going to purge it with fire. Robert Walsh came on the line, his voice flustered. Damian. What's going on? I'm getting alerts about a potential security issue at B24. The only security issue, Robert, Damian said, his voice like ice, is that 2 of my best customers, who happen to be my children, have just been publicly humiliated and denied boarding by an incompetent gate agent and her spineless manager. They are standing at gate B24 right now. Walsh was silent for a moment, the implications crashing down on him. My God, Damian, I had no idea. I'll get on it right away. I'll have them on that plane in 5 minutes. No, Robert. You will not, Damian said softly. That plane is not going anywhere. In fact, no Stellar airplane is going anywhere out of JFK for the time being. What, Damian? You can't mean that. We have 16 departures scheduled in the next 90 minutes. The logistical snarl. I am initiating an immediate fleet-wide security and protocol audit, effective immediately, originating from the JFK hub, Damian stated, inventing the policy on the spot. A serious customer service and potential security flaw has been identified, and I will not risk the integrity of the Stellar Air brand until I am satisfied it has been contained and rectified. Ground everything. I want every Stellar flight at JFK held at the gate. No takeoffs, no pushbacks. Am I clear? Robert Walsh, a man who managed a multi-billion-dollar airline's daily operations, was stunned into submission. Yes, Damian. Crystal clear. Damian hung up. He looked at Amelia. Get the car. We're going to the airport. Back at gate B24. Jailer and Jordan stood in an awkward limbo. Bailey and Carl were trying to ignore them, busying themselves with paperwork for the now departed flight. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Suddenly, the large monitor above the gate flickered. The familiar departed status next to Flight 714 vanished. In its place, in stark, blocky red letters, a new message appeared. Flight 714. On hold. Gate return. Bailey stared at it, her mouth falling open. What in the world? Her own terminal screen blinked, then displayed a system-wide alert. Operational Directive Alpha. All Stellar Air. JFK departures are hereby grounded. Repeat, all flights grounded by executive order. CEO. Damian Sterling. Await further instructions. Carl's phone buzzed violently, then Bailey's. Then the main gate line began to ring. All around them, at the other Stellar Air gates, a wave of confusion was spreading. Phones were ringing, agents were staring at their screens in disbelief, and the calm of the terminal was beginning to fray. Jordan looked at the screen, then at his sister. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. Jailer. What did Dad do? Jailer watched the chaos unfold, a quiet sense of awe and terror mixing within her. She had called for help. She had expected a manager to be overruled, maybe a flight to be held for a few minutes. She had not expected her father to bring an entire international airport hub to its knees. The order to ground the fleet spread through Stellar Air's JFK operations, not like a memo, but like a shockwave. In the cockpit of Flight 714, which had already pushed back from the gate and was third in line for takeoff, Captain Eva Rostova was running through her final pre-flight checks. Suddenly, a frantic voice from the control tower crackled over her headset. Stellar 714, hold your position. I repeat, hold your position. Return to the gate immediately. Tower, say again. Captain Rostova replied, bewildered. We are cleared for takeoff. Negative Stellar 744. Executive order from your airline. All Stellar call signs are to return to their gates and await instructions. All JFK operations are on an indefinite ground stop. Inside the plane, passengers who had settled in for the long-haul flight began to murmur as the engines powered down and the aircraft slowly began to reverse its course back toward the terminal. The flight attendants, sensing the shift, began to walk the aisles with forced smiles, offering water and platitudes without any real information. At gate B24, the scene contained pandemonium. Bailey's face had turned a pale, chalky white. Her smug superiority had evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked fear. Her phone was buzzing incessantly with calls from her union representative, her station chief, and numbers she didn't even recognize. She ignored them all, staring at her computer screen as if it might offer an explanation. Carl, the manager, was hyperventilating into a paper bag he'd procured from a nearby newsstand. His boss, the director of JFK ground operations, had just screamed at him over the phone for 5 straight minutes. A tirade that ended with the ominous words, "Stay right where you are. Don't you move a muscle." Jayla and Jordan stood apart from the chaos-silent observers of the storm they had unleashed. Jordan felt a surge of pure vindictive triumph. This was more than just getting on their flight. This was a demonstration. This was power. He caught Bailey's terrified gaze and felt a grim satisfaction. She had tried to humiliate them, and now her entire world was collapsing. Jayla, however, felt a growing sense of unease. The scale of the response was staggering, disproportionate. She looked around at the other gates where thousands of passengers were now stranded. An elderly couple, clearly heading off to see grandchildren, looked confused and worried. A group of college students, much like themselves, were groaning in frustration. A businessman was yelling into his phone about a missed merger meeting in London. This wasn't just about them anymore. Their personal grievance had become a public spectacle, a logistical nightmare affecting thousands of innocent people. The initial thrill of vindication was being replaced by the cold, heavy weight of consequence. 45 minutes later, Damian Sterling arrived. He didn't storm in with a phalanx of security. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace, flanked only by his assistant Amelia and Robert Walsh, the COO, who looked like he had aged 10 years in the last hour. Damian wore a perfectly tailored suit, a dark grey armor that seemed to absorb the light and chaos around him. His presence instantly silenced the area. Even the disgruntled passengers seemed to sense that the source of the disruption had arrived. He walked directly to the podium at gate B24. He didn't look at his children. His entire focus was on Bailey and Carl. "You are Bailey?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. Bailey could only nod, her throat too dry for words. "And you are Carl, the duty manager?" Carl lowered his paper bag. Yes, Mr. Sterling." "Sir." Damian gestured to the passport, still lying on the counter. "Please explain to me the issue with this document." Bailey, her voice trembling, repeated her justification about the smudged photo and the compromised holographic overlay. She held it under the light, her shaking hand making it impossible to see anything clearly. Damian listened patiently, his eyes never leaving her face. When she was finished, he simply said, "May I see it?" He took the passport and examined it for no more than 3 seconds. He looked at the photo, then at Jordan, then back at the photo. He turned to Robert Walsh. "Robert, you've been in this business for 30 years. Does this look like a compromised document to you?" The COO barely glanced at it. "No, Damian. It looks brand new." Damian nodded slowly. He placed the passport back on the counter. He then looked directly at Bailey, and for the first time she saw the full, unbridled power behind the man's placid exterior. It was like staring into the heart of a glacier. You did not deny my son boarding because of a security concern, Damian stated not as an accusation, but as a fact. You did it because you could. You used the infinitesimal power of your position to inconvenience and humiliate a customer because it made you feel important. You then escalated the situation, and he said. His gaze, shifting to Carl, lacked the judgment or the courage to properly assess the situation, choosing instead to rubber stamp a subordinate's poor decision. This was not a failure of policy. It was a failure of character. He turned to Robert Walsh. See to it that Bailey and Carl are relieved of their duties effective immediately. Their system access is to be revoked before I leave this terminal. They are to be escorted from the premises. Arrange their severance in accordance with the bare minimum required by their union contract. Bailey let out a small gasp. Carl looked as if he was about to faint. Damian then addressed his children. Jailer Jordan, let's go. He started to walk away, but then paused. He turned to the crowd of waiting passengers, his voice projecting across the gate area. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his tone shifting back to that of a polished CEO. My name is Damian Sterling. I am the CEO of this airline's parent company. There has been a significant customer service failure here today, which has unfortunately necessitated a temporary halt in our operations to address. I know you have all been grievously inconvenienced, and for that I offer my deepest and most sincere apologies. He looked at Amelia. Amelia, I want every passenger on every affected flight to receive a full refund, a voucher for a future first-class international flight and meal and hotel accommodations as needed. I want it processed today. A wave of murmurs, this time of surprise and appreciation, went through the crowd. In a single stroke, he had reframed the narrative from a personal vendetta to a grand gesture of corporate responsibility. He then looked at his children. Your trip to Ibiza will have to wait. I have a jet waiting for us at the private terminal. We're going to the Hamptons. We have things to discuss. As they walked away, leaving the wreckage of 2 careers and a logistical disaster in their wake, Jordan felt an undeniable sense of awe. His father was a king, and he had just witnessed a king's justice. Jailer, however, felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. As she passed the throngs of stranded travelers, she saw a young woman weeping into her phone, talking about missing her sister's wedding in Rome. She saw the faces of the flight crews, their schedules in chaos. She saw Bailey, her face a mask of utter devastation, being quietly spoken to by a grim-faced security official. They had won. The victory felt absolute. But as she watched her father, a man who had just casually rearranged thousands of lives to right a small wrong, she couldn't shake the feeling that the price for this victory was still being calculated, and it was going to be far higher than she could ever imagine. The flight to the Hamptons on the Sterling Global private jet was a study in surreal silence. The Gulfstream G650 was the pinnacle of luxury aviation, a world away from the commercial terminal they had just left. Cream leather seats, polished mahogany, and a silent attendant who served them sparkling water without being asked. Jordan was still buzzing with adrenaline. He sank into the plush seat, a grin of triumph plastered on his face. That was epic, he breathed, looking at his father with newfound reverence. You didn't just fix it, Dad. You brought the hammer down. They'll be talking about that at JFK for years. Damian Sterling, who was staring out the window at the receding New York skyline, didn't respond immediately. The cold fury had dissipated, leaving behind a deep, weary calm. "Power is not a hammer, Jordan," he said finally, his voice low. "It's a scalpel. It should be used for precise, clean cuts. What happened today was messy. It was necessary, but messy." Jailer, seated across from them, felt the weight of that messiness. All those people, Dad. The other flights. Was it really necessary to ground the whole fleet? We saw a woman who was going to miss her sister's wedding. Damian turned his gaze to her. His expression was unreadable. "There are two things I will not tolerate in my organization, Jailer: incompetence and disrespect. What you experienced was a symptom of a deeper problem. Sometimes, to ensure the health of the entire system, you have to administer a shock. A strong, unforgettable message must be sent from the boardroom down to the baggage handlers. Our standards are absolute. Every single passenger deserves respect. The fact that it was my own children who were the catalyst is irrelevant." He said the words with such conviction that Jailer almost believed him. But she had seen his face when she'd made that call. She knew this wasn't just about corporate standards. This was personal. This was a father protecting his own, using the full, terrifying might of his empire to do it. Their weekend in the Hamptons was meant to be a reset, but the events at the airport lingered in the air. News of the Stellar Air JFK shutdown was already circulating online. The initial reports were vague, citing operational issues and a security review. The company's PR machine, a well-oiled beast, was working overtime, spinning Damian's grand gesture of compensation as a shining example of customer-first leadership. For a day or two it seemed to work. Jordan and Jailer relaxed, the incident fading into an exciting anecdote they would tell their friends. They lounged by the infinity pool of their sprawling beachfront estate, the trauma of the fluorescent-lit airport terminal a distant memory. The victory felt sweet and complete. They had faced down injustice and their father. Their hero had made it right. But the digital world moves faster than a private jet. By Sunday afternoon, the real story began to leak. It started with a single disgruntled baggage handler who posted on a Reddit aviation forum. "You guys hearing about the JFK ground stop wasn't a security issue. It's because the CEO's kids got denied boarding on the Ibiza flight." From there, it was a spark on dry tinder. An anonymous flight attendant confirmed the story to a gossip blogger. A passenger from a delayed London flight, a journalist for a British tabloid, started making calls. By Monday morning, what had been a contained corporate issue exploded into a full-blown international media firestorm. The headlines were brutal. The New York Post. "High Air Brats. Billionaire CEO grounds fleet after twin teens throw tantrum Forbes. Sterling's ego trip, how a father's rage cost Stellar Air. $90 million in a single afternoon. The Guardian, an airline held hostage, the Sterling saga, and the perils of unchecked corporate power. The narrative had flipped entirely. Damian Sterling was no longer the champion of customer service. He was an out-of-touch oligarch. Jordan and Jailer were no longer victims of a petty bureaucrat. They were spoiled, entitled children whose minor inconvenience had caused chaos for thousands. Their photos, pulled from their social media accounts, were plastered everywhere. Lounging on yachts at charity galas, living a life of unimaginable privilege. They were the perfect villains for a world hungry to resent the 1%. The phone call Jailer had made was now being portrayed as the ultimate weaponization of privilege. The story of Bailey, the fired gate agent, also went viral. She was interviewed by a major news network, where she tearfully recounted her side of the story. She presented herself as a hard-working single mother, a diligent employee just trying to follow the rules, who was crushed by a billionaire's whim. She conveniently omitted her condescending attitude and rigid refusal to seek a second opinion. To the public, she was David, and Damian Sterling was a Goliath who had used a sledgehammer to swat a fly. A GoFundMe for Bailey's legal defense and living expenses raised over $200,000 in 2 days. The fallout was catastrophic. Stellar Air's stock, which was part of the publicly traded Sterling Global Aviation SGA, went into freefall. Investors were spooked not by the financial cost of the shutdown, but by the reckless, emotional decision-making it revealed at the very top. The board of directors of SGA, a collection of powerful figures who had long trusted Damian's steady hand, were now fielding furious calls from shareholders. Damian, holed up in his Manhattan office, watched the empire he had spent a lifetime building begin to crack. The clean, precise scalpel he thought he had used had turned out to be a rusty blade, introducing a sepsis of public outrage into the bloodstream of his company. The reckoning was coming, and it arrived in the form of an email from Marcus Thorne, the lead independent director on the SGA board. The subject line contained only 3 words: emergency board meeting. The victory at gate B24 was now a distant memory, a puff of smoke. The real price, Jayla realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach, was just now coming due. The emergency board meeting was convened not in the opulent boardroom on the 58th floor, but in a sterile, anonymous conference room at a law firm downtown. The change of venue was a clear signal this was not business as usual. This was an inquisition. Damian Sterling, for the first time in his professional life, was on the defensive. He walked into the room, and the customary friendly chatter died. The 10 board members, men and women he had known for years, people he had made incredibly wealthy, looked at him with cold, appraising eyes. They were no longer his colleagues. They were his judges. At the head of the table sat Marcus Thorne. Thorne was everything. Damian was not old money. Ivy League legacy, a man who moved through the world with an unshakable belief in his own inherited right to power. He and Damian had always maintained a professional but frosty relationship. Thorne saw Damian as a brilliant but volatile upstart. Damian saw Thorne as a calculating parasite more interested in shareholder optics than in building a real business. Damian Thorne began, his voice smooth as silk. "Thank you for joining us. I think we can dispense with the pleasantries. We're here to discuss what the media has unfortunately dubbed Stellargate. We need to understand the colossal failure in judgment that occurred last Friday." Damian stood tall, projecting an aura of control he did not feel. "Marcus, let me be clear. There was a failure, but it was not mine. It was a systemic failure of customer service and protocol on the ground. My children were subjected to unprofessional and potentially discriminatory treatment. I took decisive action to send a message that such behavior will not be tolerated within this organization." A woman on the board, a former tech CEO named Eleanor Vance, scoffed audibly. "Decisive action. Damian, you grounded an entire hub based on an anecdote from your teenage children. You cost this company nearly $100 million in direct losses and compensation, and that's before we even begin to calculate the brand damage. Our market cap has dropped by 12% in 2 days. That's over $3 billion in shareholder value gone, wiped out by a father's temper tantrum. This was not a tantrum." Damian countered, his voice rising slightly. "It was an executive decision to demonstrate our commitment to our principles." "And what principle is that?" Marcus Thorne interjected, leaning forward. His eyes glinted. The principle that the Sterling family is above the rules that govern everyone else. The principle that thousands of paying customers, the people who actually fund your children's lifestyle, can have their lives thrown into chaos over a disputed passport smudge. He gestured to a large screen on the wall where a stream of news clips was playing on a loop. The weeping bride-to-be, who missed her sister's wedding. A soldier trying to get home on leave. A family whose long-saved-for Disney vacation was ruined. Then a clip of Bailey, the fired gate agent on a morning talk show, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "I was just trying to do my job," she said, pitifully. I never thought a powerful man could just ruin my life like that." "That woman Thorne said, pointing at the screen, is now a folk hero. She has a book deal in the works titled Gatekeeper. She is the face of the working class, standing up to corporate tyranny. And you, Damian, you are the face of that tyranny. You have single-handedly turned this airline, our airline, into a symbol of elitist arrogance." Damian felt the room closing in. He had anticipated anger, but not this surgical unified assault. He had built this company from a single leased freighter into a global behemoth. These people worked for him. But in the court of public opinion, and now in the court of his own boardroom, the narrative was set in stone. He was the villain. The karma was not just swift, it was brutal. It wasn't some cosmic force. It was the collective power of the crowd, the stranded passengers, the outraged public, the opportunistic media, and now the terrified shareholders. His act of absolute power had created a vacuum, and this new narrative had rushed in to fill it. Meanwhile, back in the Sterling penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Jayla and Jordan were living in a self-imposed prison. They hadn't left the apartment in 2 days. Their phones were an endless scroll of hatred. They were vilified in memes, their faces photoshopped onto Marie Antoinette's body. Former friends were either silent or posting vague, sanctimonious messages about privilege. Jordan, whose initial triumph had been so absolute, was now a wreck. He paced the living room, agitated and confused. "I don't get it," he kept saying. She was wrong. She was rude, and she was on a power trip. Dad just did what any powerful father would do. Why are we the bad guys? Jayla sat curled up on a sofa, silent. She understood all too well. Her calm, analytical mind saw the chain of events with horrifying clarity. She had made the call. She had set the pieces in motion. She had thought she was being strategic, but she had failed to see the board, to see the entire world outside their privileged bubble. Their father had taught them to play chess, but they had been playing on a board with 1,000,000 squares they didn't even know existed. Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert. FAA launches formal investigation into Stellar Air Ground. Stop. Cites irregular and potentially unlawful use of executive authority. Jayla felt a wave of nausea. This was no longer just about public relations or stock prices. The federal government was now involved. Her father, the untouchable titan, was now in the crosshairs of the one entity even he could not control. The phone call to her father was supposed to be a lifeline. Instead, she had handed him an anchor. And now she could only watch as he and the entire world he had built for them began to sink. The final verdict in the boardroom was delivered without ceremony. Marcus Thorne called for a vote of no confidence in the Chief Executive Officer, Damian Sterling. The result was a landslide, 9-1. The only vote in Damian's favor was his own, a final futile act of defiance. The board has decided to terminate your employment as CEO of Sterling Global Aviation effective immediately, Thorne announced, his voice clinical. You will be offered a severance package contingent on your full cooperation during the transition. The board will be appointing an interim CEO by the end of the day. Damian Sterling stood up. He looked around the table at the faces of the people who had just dismantled his life's work. There was no pity in their eyes, only the cold calculus of self-preservation. He had made them vulnerable, and they had cut him loose. It was the law of the corporate jungle, a law he himself had lived by for 30 years. He didn't say a word. He simply turned, walked out of the room, and took the elevator down to the lobby. As he stepped out onto the street, his phone vibrated. It was the same news alert Jailer had just seen. He was no longer a CEO facing a federal investigation. He was just a private citizen. He walked the 20 blocks back to his penthouse, an anonymous figure in the river of humanity for the first time in decades. The suit that had once felt like armor now felt like a costume. When he entered the apartment, Jailer and Jordan rushed to him. They saw the look on his face and knew instantly. The king had been deposed. "Dad," Jailer started, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I made the call. This is my fault." Jordan was ashen-faced. "No, it was me. I lost my temper. I escalated it. If I had just stayed calm." Damian looked at his children, his two brilliant, beloved children, and saw not the architects of his downfall, but the reason for it. He had wanted to protect them, to show them that the world would bend to their will, because they were his. In doing so, he had taught them the wrong lesson. He had shown them power without teaching them the wisdom of when not to use it. "No," he said, his voice heavy, with a profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. "This is not your fault. It's mine. I built this world for you, but I forgot to build the foundation. I forgot that for every action there is a reaction. The world is bigger than one man, one company, one family." The karma that had come for them wasn't mystical. It was brutally simple. It was the karma of a connected world where every action is recorded, judged, and amplified. It was the karma of public perception, a force more powerful than any fleet of airplanes. In the weeks that followed, the Sterling Empire was carved up. Marcus Thorne was named the new CEO, and his first act was to issue a public apology and offer Bailey her job back along with a significant settlement. She politely declined as her book deal and speaking tour were far more lucrative. She became a minor celebrity, a symbol of the little guy her initial pettiness and prejudice completely erased from the public narrative. Stellar Air rebranded, changing its logo and slogan in an attempt to distance itself from the scandal. Damian Sterling became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, a modern-day Icarus who flew too close to the sun on wings of paternal pride. The twins' trip to Ibiza never happened. The thought of a vacation was sickening. They were pariahs at their university before they even started. Their name, once a golden ticket, was now a mark of shame. The final bitterest twist came a month later. Damian was watching the news, a habit he couldn't break. An interviewer was speaking to Bailey at a book signing. Looking back, the interviewer asked, "Do you feel any sympathy for Damian Sterling?" "He lost everything." Bailey smiled, a practiced, humble expression on her face. "I try not to hold any ill will," she said. "I believe everything happens for a reason. He was just a man who made a bad choice. In the end, we all have to answer for our choices. We all have a final boarding call, And if you're not right with the world, you'll be denied. Damian switched off the television. The silence in the vast, empty penthouse was deafening. He had pulled the plug on a fleet of airplanes to win a small battle for his children. In return, the world had pulled the plug on his entire universe. The karma wasn't just hard, it was poetic. It was absolute. And there was no one to call to fix it. 18 months is a long time in the outrage cycle of the modern world. The Stellargate scandal had faded from the headlines, replaced by newer, fresher controversies. For the public, the Sterlings were a forgotten meme, a cautionary tale that had run its course. But for the family themselves, the fallout was a permanent weather system. They woke up to every single day. Damian Sterling, now a ghost in the world he once commanded, lived a quiet life in a modest Connecticut home purchased under his lawyer's name. He had sold the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and every other trapping of his former life to cover legal fees and settle shareholder lawsuits. He spent his days reading philosophy writing, what he called notes on failure, and speaking to his children in infrequent, stilted phone calls. The Titan had become a recluse. The twins, however, had chosen two vastly different paths to navigate the crater left in their lives. Their journey was the true ongoing epilogue of the karma they had summoned. Jordan refused to let go. He saw himself and his family not as perpetrators of hubris, but as victims of a vindictive mob. He'd dropped out of NYU after one semester, unable to bear the whispers and the infamy that clung to the Sterling name. He used what was left of his trust fund to dabble in high-risk crypto ventures, chasing the ghost of his father's power. He surrounded himself with a new fast crowd, people who were impressed by the lingering aura of his family's former wealth, and either didn't know or didn't care about the scandal. He was chasing a past that no longer existed, his anger a shield against his shame. Jailer, on the other hand, had run toward the shame, determined to understand its anatomy. She'd legally changed her surname to Evans, her mother's maiden name, and enrolled at a state university in Colorado. She lived in a small off-campus apartment and took a part-time job waiting tables at a busy downtown diner called the Corner Booth. It was there, in the clatter of plates and the controlled chaos of a lunch rush, that Jordan finally found her. He walked in on a Tuesday afternoon, looking jarringly out of place in his designer jacket and expensive sneakers. He saw her, her hair tied back, wearing a simple black apron clearing a table. The sight of his sister Sterling wiping up spilled ketchup filled him with a hot, visceral anger. "Jailer," he said, his voice cutting through the diner's chatter. She froze, a stack of dirty plates in her hands. She had dreaded this moment. "Jordan, what are you doing here? What am I doing here? What are you doing here?" he hissed, gesturing around the greasy spoon. "This is a joke, right? You're Jailer Evans now. A waitress. Is this your idea of penance?" She finished stacking the plates and led him to a small, empty booth in the back. "It's my life, Jordan. I'm paying my own bills. I'm getting my degree. I'm studying law." "Law?" he scoffed. "So you can what? Sue Dad's old board members? Finally get some justice?" "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "So I can understand it. The system, corporate ethics, civil rights, the things we were so ignorant about, the power we treated like a toy." Jordan slumped into the booth, his frustration boiling over. "I don't believe this. I came here to talk to you about a plan. I've been speaking to a PR firm. There's a path back for us for Dad. We can start telling our side of the story, reframe the narrative. We can rebuild the Sterling name. But I need you. We need to be a united front." Jailer looked at her brother, and for the first time she didn't see the charming, confident twin she'd grown up with. She saw a lost boy desperately trying to glue together the shards of a shattered mirror. "There is no reframing, Jordan," she said, softly. "We did what we did. Dad did what he did. The narrative is the truth. We were arrogant, we were entitled, and we caused a mess that ruined lives, not just our own." "Bailey's life wasn't ruined," he shot back. "She's a rich author now, a professional victim. I'm not talking about Bailey. I'm talking about the bride who missed the wedding, the soldier who didn't get home, the thousands of people we saw as collateral damage. They were real people, Jordan, just like the people I serve here every day. They have their own problems, and they don't involve grounding fleets over a bruised ego." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading with him. "The Sterling name isn't something we can reclaim with a press release. A name isn't what you inherit, it's what you build. And ours is gone. We have to build new ones on a better foundation." Jordan stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. "So that's it. You're just going to hide here, pretending to be someone else for the rest of your life?" "I'm not hiding," Jayla said, a newfound strength in her voice. "For the first time in my life, I'm not hiding behind Dad's money or his power. I'm just being me. And you should try it too." He stood up his chair, scraping loudly on the linoleum. The gulf between them was no longer just geographical, it was philosophical. They were survivors of the same shipwreck, now washed up on entirely different continents. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he said, his voice cold. He turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Jayla alone in the booth, the weight of their old name and the hope of a new one settling around her. So what do we take away from the dramatic fall of the Sterling family? This story serves as a powerful modern-day fable about the nature of power. It shows how an act of extreme privilege intended to protect can backfire in the most spectacular way. In our hyper-connected world, the court of public opinion can be more powerful than any boardroom. The line between victim and villain can be redrawn overnight by a viral headline or a trending hashtag. What do you think? Was Damian Sterling a father justifiably protecting his children from disrespect and bias? Or was this the ultimate act of ego from a billionaire who thought he was above the rules? Was Bailey a hard-working employee just doing her job? Or was she a petty tyrant who got a taste of her own medicine before the story twisted? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Who was the real villain here? If this story captivated you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good drama, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more true life stories where power, money, and karma collide. Thanks for listening.